My talk's about, as Mark said, my current research and how it informs my practice. I've sort of broken up the talk into 3 sections, hopefully, which should give you an overview about the background to the collection in terms of Hardman, its structure, what it physically looks like, and also perhaps some difficulties associated with working within a photographic collection of this nature. And then hopefully I'll be able to talk about my activity within this archive, focusing upon my methodology and the objectives surrounding the research. Section 3 should hopefully show you some of the creative output that's come as a result of this research. Okay. So in terms of background then, Hardman, there's quite a lot of transfer actually with what I'm going to talk to you about, particularly in relation to Les's presentation there. And I even cite kind of similar references as well. I want to spend a bit of time looking specifically at 2 portraits and have a real kind of breakdown and a deep look into these 2 particular portraits, which have been the cause of much of the feedback and analysis of one of the particular projects that I've worked on, which is called Intermissions Portraits. So in terms of Hardman then, just to give you a potted sort of history, he's a Liverpool-based commercial portrait photographer that was practicing between 1923 to 1963. He's better known for his landscape work and topographical views of the city, of which I'll show you a few of. But he has this kind of vast collection which was sold to the library in Liverpool in the mid-70s. I think it was in lieu of some council rates that he couldn't afford to pay. So he sold this collection, and the funds were raised publicly for the purchase of it. But on its arrival, it was so vast that the library didn't realise what they were getting themselves involved with, I think. And it took them a year to figure out that what he'd given them wasn't what they thought they were buying. So he kind of cherry-picked all the best stuff out of it and gave them all this commercial portraiture, which turned up in about 300 biscuit tins, which I'll show you. And it's that component of the archive that I'm interested in. This, you can't really see it at the bottom there, but there is a section at the bottom which it's about 140,000 commercial portraits. There is existing research that has been conducted within this collection, and this particular individual, Peter Hegarty, was key to rescuing a lot of the work, albeit towards the end of the 80s when Hardman died. The work that I'm involved with, or the components of the collection that I'm involved with, was already in the library at that stage in the mid-70s, just kind of decomposing on shelves. So the house itself still exists. You can go and check it out if you're in Liverpool. It's a good example of a working sort of studio, and it's situated 59 Rodney Street. And it's a conservation project that was progressed by the National Trust, which has complicated matters in terms of the ownership of the collection. These are a couple of examples of the works that Hardman's better known for, these kind of views of Liverpool, and particularly this one, which is the Birth of the Ark Royal, which was taken in the early 50s. What I'm working with is this. So these are the biscuit tins. There's about 100 odd there, but there's about 300 or so in total. And it's a bit of a daunting sort of exercise when you look at this collection of tins. You're presented with this collection of tins, each one of which houses 400 separate negatives of people. Nobody knew really what was in them. So the first exercise for me was to kind of try and map it and to figure out what it was I was dealing with. When you open them up, this is what you're faced with, and they're all at different levels of decomposition. Some of them have totally gone through this, what's called vinegar syndrome, where they all just clamp together and you can't see anything. But others are in very good condition and can be worked with and are very good quality once you've scanned. One of the difficulties associated with working with this material is that a lot of the pre-1940 material is based on cellulose nitrate, which is decomposing via an acidic hydrolysis pathway. Therefore, it's exuding these nitrogen oxides. So you have to work in a fumation cupboard. And if you work with it for any length of time, you get quite giddy because you're inhaling nitrous oxide in effect, and it's just like laughing gas. So it's, you're kind of stumbling around thinking, oh, look at these pretty portraits. So the next section I wanted to speak to you about really is photographic collections and working with, in particular, photographic negative collections. In terms of the photographic collections held in libraries and museums, photographs are increasingly being understood as knowledge objects in their own right. Edwards and Morton argue that photographs have what could be described as being parallel histories that weave around each other like a double helix. The first history relates to them being collected as both an image and an object, and the second in supporting their role in the broader curatorial practice of institutions which hold them. Few photographic collections are fully inventoried, never mind catalogued, and only few institutions employ curators with a specific knowledge of photographs and their curatorial needs. They go on to highlight the fact that photography as a museum practice and as an area of collecting is seldom taught on museum courses. In fact, many museums, especially those under UK local authorities, have offloaded many collections to sister archives or institutions in an attempt to rationalise them. The net result is that photographs have, for different reasons, been placed outside of the museum collecting and knowledge systems to which they actually belong. These historical circumstances of marginality and low or confused status are part of the history of photographic collections. Such historical practices and processes have meant that there is little understanding in most museums or libraries of how these photographic collections were acquired, or even when or why. The usual key sources for this, such as the donor or dealer correspondence, accession registers, provenance, etc., are frequently missing in relation to photographs. This scenario certainly plays out in terms of the Hardman collection, although where correspondence between both Hardman and the library does exist at the point of transfer in the mid-70s, it was well hidden and difficult to find. In addition to this, and on closer inspection, the existing correspondence confirms the above by highlighting the inability of the library at the time to either secure what they thought they had purchased or even the right to reproduce it. This has culminated into a scenario where the library physically owns the Hardman photographic material, so the negatives are owned by the library, but cannot reproduce it due to the copyright being passed down through the Hardman Trust and ending up with the National Trust. Again, Edwards and Morton quote, although photographs have been actively sought and acquired by museums and libraries, their ambiguous status outside of formal structures of curatorship has meant that they have been historically vulnerable to the redrawing of collection boundaries and curatorial territories. In addition to this, Athol Macready goes on to state in his paper dealing with the collection of Maori images held at the Museum of New Zealand that museums have largely controlled the meaning of the photographs they hold, as historically they have been either generated or acquired by them for the scholarly purposes of the institution. But as museum collections are progressively being seen as public resources, they have become subject to more complex interpretations, reflecting both public demand and cultural politics. Rather than being laid to rest in workrooms to be sorted and classified by specialists like natural history specimens, photographs or negatives often enter a second life within museums, where they can occupy an increasingly expansive public space. In this way, museums have become more outwardly focused, viewing collections less as a resource for academics and increasingly for the use of the broader public. Now, if we extend this further, or more specifically, into negative collections, Damarie Samau, in relation to the Eli Lotar collection, argues that the negative should be considered an artifact, unlike a photograph, which can be considered like a document and can be read. Negatives require specialist translation in order for sense to be made of them, inversion to a positive state through either enlargement or contact printing via the analog process, or scanning and post-production through digital means. Of more recent times, the latter has proved to be essential within the use of dealing with such material. Therefore, large collections of negative material are often considered a burden to many institutions, with the already existing photographic print being privileged above them, as established through the traditions of the historic print and drawing departments. Institutions often struggle to be able to deal with such material, either physically or intellectually, with Liverpool Library being no exception to this. Amau goes on to state that many institutions label such material as non-art objects and can literally shy away from their use as exhibitable material. Within traditional curatorial practice, often even attempting to interrupt their use, it is certainly true that of the Hardman collection, the bulk of interest lies within the print collection, with the majority of its current users having little or no specialist photographic background, thus rendering the negative materials beyond both their grasp or interest. So hence one of my key objectives to this project, which I'll elaborate upon in the next section. For the purpose of museum accession, posthumous prints are often made from negative material, with a signed vintage print reflecting both the photographer's completed work and also a demonstration of their personal selection process, as opposed to that of a curator. In this sense, the showing of the posthumous prints, or in this instance, the intermission portraits, in glass display cabinets makes sense to archival intervention within the Hardman collection as a reminder of the fact the work has come directly from the negative state, as held in the archive, which is actually housed beneath. In addition to this, the work being displayed is therefore not directly that of Hardman, given that the selection has been made from his oeuvre through my curatorial process, which again will be elaborated upon more in the next section. So if we move on now to the second section, which is the archival intervention, this gives you an indication as to what my objectives are in terms of what I'm trying to achieve with my my archival intervention. So I'd like, and there's a lot of these objectives tie in with, I think, what Les was saying with this project, the notion of trying to get this work seen and certainly back to the communities from where it was hidden. It's hidden from the communities from where it originated. So I want to raise the profile, if I can, of these portraits. I've put a couple of interesting portraits up. There's a young George Melly there, which is, there's a few others that kind of pop up as we go through the presentation. So my intention is to try and raise the profile of this portraiture component of the collection, because it's seen as the poor cousin to a lot of the landscape work, which is always, the prints have always been privileged above the negatives in the biscuit tins. So again, and I'm attempting to try and shift the functional status of this component of the archive from what was essentially a commercial and hidden function to a more kind of open and public and an artistic arena for people to interact with and for narratives to be generated. I'm trying to reveal patterns, and I'm doing this essentially through the development of a database which has mapped the archive, which I'll talk to you a little bit about in a minute. There are difficulties associated with dealing with an archive of this nature. Its age and its size, are really challenging things to try and overcome. And access to it has not always been forthcoming due to funding constraints and people not being imposed to be able to physically allow you to get hold of the material. It brings into question ownership as well. This is something that I'm always very interested in when creating the work that I'm showing of Hardman. So you think to yourself, the Liverpool Library physically owns the collection, which was paid for by the public. So the public must own a slice. But then the National Trust owns the copyright, which is bequeathed to them through the Hardman Trust. But then there's a client that commissioned the work to be done. So Mrs. Melly commissioned the photograph of George to be taken. So they have ownership of it. They're instructing Hardman to take the photograph. in addition to this, there are what we call intermediaries, which during a photographic portraiture session, there are 6 photographs taken, of which only 1 will be progressed to the client, which the client ends up with. So there's all this other stuff that's sat in the archive. So does Hardman own this? He originally owned it. Or is it me? Do I own it? I'm the one who's responsible for dealing with it. I'm the one who's requesting it to be pulled out. I'm scanning it, putting it through post-production, presenting it and displaying it, and tweeting it. So it raises all these kind of questions, which are quite interesting. In terms of my methodology then, I'll just briefly, it looks a bit daunting this, but it's not really. It's like, it looks a lot more complicated than it actually is. There's 3 phases, of which, out of all the phases, the third sort of stage, the selection stage, is the most important, because it's here where I am challenging myself with why. What's the purpose of what it is that I'm selecting? Why am I making these decisions? So the creation stage is obviously, I've developed a database which has been populated with 120,000 records taken from the studio registers. And this has provided essentially the vehicle through which to navigate the entire commercial portraiture collection. The interrogation stage involves me sorting and searching on this database to try and reveal these patterns. And the selection stage is the question, what purpose, what am I trying to achieve through showing these portraits? And there's been a number of different ways in which I've shown this work. The intermissions portraits is just one of them, which I'll focus on more. The extraction stage is to do with the library, really. I need to indicate to them specifically what it is I want to see, and they go away, they pull it out the freezers, it's left to acclimatise for 24 hours, and then I open the tin and the negative isn't in there. So I go straight back to square one. So it's a very hit and miss process, which in itself is frustrating. Observation stage involves the physical handling and viewing of the negative materials. The documentation stage is the physical scanning of the material. It's quite laborious. You need a close attention to detail. And then the presentation stage is the final stage where I consider where I'm going to put it, what I'm going to do with it once I've got it. So to have a quick look at the database, this is what it looks like once it's digitized. It's pretty boring, really. You've got a whole list of details that have been directly copied from these physical studio registers, which tell me what are in those biscuit tins. But as a result of it, it allows me to do some quite interesting things. It gives me the key to extract exactly what it is I want and identify, because otherwise it's just like looking for a needle in a haystack. If you look at some other information that comes out of it, it provides all sorts of statistical data which we've never known about Hardman's practice. So, for instance, over the course of his entire practice, 77% of all the portraits that were taken were actually taken in Bold Street, not Rodney Street. So the 2 studios, he moved to Rodney Street in the late 40s. So this is something that we were unaware of. In essence, what it shows is his practice was actually in decline when he moved to Rodney Street. He'd done the bulk of his work, his commercial portraiture work. Or 35% of all the portraits were shot during the 6-year period during World War II. So that's quite an interesting statistic. 35% of all these portraits are in 6 years between the 6 years of World War II. So all that kind of statistical information falls out. If you look at an individual negative, this is what it looks like when it comes out of the tin. It's in a glassine case, a sleeve, sorry, and the unique number is on the side here. And then once you invert this for the first time, this is quite a magical moment. In this instance, it's a composer and pianist called Gordon Green, who's taken in the early 30s. And it's quite a magical moment, you're literally breathing life back into this person who's just been sat dormant on a shelf for 70, 80 years. Okay, so in terms of the creative output then, I've focused on 3 main areas. I started with rephotography, and I had an issue to begin with, in terms of I felt as if I needed to be making photographs. I felt as if I needed to use a camera and a lens and create some photographs in response to this collection. And it took me a long time to get over that and to be able to think in a different way, that me working with existing material that another photographer has taken in a more curatorial role was sufficient enough to present. And I struggled with that a lot. So to begin with, I was involved with rephotographing some of the existing locations, and some of them were really interesting. Some of them haven't changed at all. Then I moved on to the chronotype, which is this idea of a sequential series of portraits. If you can imagine, Hardman's practice spanned 40 years. So you've got the same individual that's going back over the 40-year period and having his portrait taken, or her portrait taken. With the use of the database, you can find that individual by sorting on the surname, and you can find the exact negative number and find the exact tin. So you can go along and pick out. Without that, it would be a case of going through the entire thing, which is impossible. So these are the kind of patterns that have been revealed. And then the typology, because he recorded the title of each sitter very specifically. So it might have been a captain or a major or a member of the clergy, or any different title. So you can sort on title and then start producing typologies. So just looking firstly at the rephotography. This portrait was taken by Hardman in 1937 of Lady Delamere outside Vale Royal, and then I revisited it using large format camera, film, the same kind of apparatus that Hardman would have used to rephotograph. And then I started playing around with putting the images together and making layers, but this didn't really go very far, and it's obviously quite, it's been done a lot before. Just out of interest, though, the little boy on the right now looks like that. I found him. He's the 5th Baron of Delamere. He lives in Kenya now, and that was on his 80th birthday. And he'd not seen these photographs before, and I'd sent them. So there are stories that are emerging from the research I've been conducting, which is quite interesting. These people are finding out that these photographs still exist, or seeing them for the first time, or telling stories about the one portrait that they've seen of this particular individual or ancestor is how they know that individual. But then you present them with the other 6 portraits from that sitting, and all of a sudden they're seeing them from different angles and different lights, different smiles and different facial expressions, and it becomes unknown to them, this individual, which is really quite interesting. So yeah, this is Hugh. This portrait on the left was taken by Hardman in 1936, and I really liked it. There was a series that were taken, and unbeknown to me, I was from Formby originally. It was taken on a road that I've walked down a million times. So I've walked past this space, and it's still there. It's at the back of Formby Library, but it's different now, because obviously the land's been sold off. The house is still there, but the back garden's been sold off. But there is still evidence of Dr. Sykes. He was well known for his orchard, apparently. And there's the odd tree that's still there, just randomly bearing fruit every year, just in the corner of this back area of Formby Library. So you'd see it and think, why on earth would that tree be there? But it's part of this extended land. So here we have the first example of a chronotype, and I'll focus a little bit more on this now. What's been most moving about this work is the fact that through the use of the database, these portraits have been brought together for the first time to be viewed simultaneously. And they've just been sat meters apart for decades on the shelves. So by bringing them together, it looks as if they belong together. Some have obviously have what I call this gap, this intermission, is larger than others. From 1925 to 1947, some is a lot shorter. And it's this shorter gap that's really intrigued me. If I just focus on these 2 portraits for a second and just read you a little bit of an analysis about these portraits. From all the intermission portraits I've shown to date, this pairing has generated the most interest in terms of comment and analysis, a significant number of which has been based around the 6-year gap between the two portraits. There are obvious assumptions to be made here, particularly in light of the fact the left-hand portrait, the younger, has come from the mid-conflict period, and the right-hand portrait, the older, has come from the post-conflict period. So starting with the left-hand portrait, Davis the Younger, through isolating the features of the face alone within the younger portrait, excluding the hair and presenting this with the isolated detail from another portrait taken during the same sitting, Davis could be described as displaying an androgynous appearance. The pursed lips alone are very delicate and feminine looking, which combined with the rounded eyes and prominent eyebrows would easily pass for being either male or female. So male hairstyles of this date drew influence from the cinematic film stars of the day, such as Clark Gable, etc., and tended to display longer hair on the top and the front of the head, side-parted and slicked back with the use of hair products such as Brill-Cream in order to easily accommodate the wearing of a hat. British officers would have been no exception to this fashion, but Davis's hair specifically looks longer than most, with the side parting taken across the forehead quite low in a very controlled manner. The negative for this actual portrait has been physically retouched by Hardman, with the removal of a few wayward strands at the top back of the head, and that were carelessly pointing up towards upwards during the shoot. As David Bates suggests in his 4th chapter, Seeing Portraits, in his Photography Key Concepts publication, facial expressions signify a repertoire of states, indicating the potential mood of the person wearing them. So it could be anger, sadness, frustration, melancholy. He goes on to say that the whole gamut of emotions relating to life have conventional expressions signified by the way of face. It should also be observed that these expressions are not indicative of a fixed state of being, given the portrait is a snapshot of time. In respect of this, Davis's expression could be described as being blank, but what disturbs us more in viewing this portrait is the intense direct stare he gives back into the camera, emphasised all the more through his larger than average sized clear eyes. His facial features taken in combination could be described as being neutral, which could potentially hide his current feelings or emotions, but his eyes and deadly stare give the game away to a certain extent. The portrait includes score marks made directly into the emulsion of the negative, creating a rectangle within the constraints of the rebate. This tells us that Davis's intended use for the portrait would have been for identity purposes. Therefore, the instructed Hardman would be required to crop the portrait appropriately, ensuring it met the indexical and objective prerequisites such a portrait would require. Bate goes on to say that just as the expression on the face is the rhetoric of the mood, so the pose contributes to the signification of character, attitude, and social position. Davis faces the camera on a slightly profiled angle, with one shoulder nearer than the other. He is neither slumped nor excessively erect, but comfortably poised, allowing the viewer to perceive a forthright and dutiful air of compliance. Without his headdress, the angle of his head is almost vertical, differing from the other portraits taken during the same sitting, where the headdress is included and where the head is cocked slightly to the side, probably under Hardman's instruction. Both his upper arms appear to be relaxed by his side, with his hands not featured in any of the portraits from this sitting, unlike the older portrait on the right. The clothing Davis wears is of standard army issue for a commissioned officer in the British Army at this point in time. His khaki No. 2 dress tunic displays his rank on the epaulets as lieutenant, and his lapel badge indicates he was a member of the Cheshire Regiment. It is worth noting here the fact Davis was a lieutenant at the time when the portrait was taken in 1943, suggesting he had already seen active service during the past 4 years of the war, in order to make the promotion from second lieutenant at the point of first commission. The shoulder strap of his leather sand-brown belt can be seen worn over the furthest shoulder, falling slightly out of focus into the background of the portrait. His necktie displays a single Windsor knot, the tail of which is pushed upwards so as it stands forthright and above the apex of the lapels, which was a fashion which had its origins in the US amongst the Ivy League at that time. The location of the portrait is studio-based, and at this point in time would have been taken at Hardman's Bowl Street studio, where he practiced until 1949. The background offers the viewer no additional context and consists of a plain off-white backdrop. slightly out of focus with a ridged vertical area protruding from the foregrounded shoulder. There are no props, either intentional or accidental, evident within the portrait, thus offering the viewer no further clues to the identity of the sitter. If we move on to the right-hand portrait now, Davis the Older, 6 years later, we see a very different Davis. Firstly, the face appears leaner with a clearer definition of the cheekbones, which gives it an altogether more slender look. It is clearly the same person based upon his unique features, who has aged significantly staring back at us, but there is a feeling that something else has changed within this short time frame. Of course, we cannot be certain of what may have driven this change without the facts surrounding his life during the intermission period, but we can be clear that physically he looks completely different. His complexion has now become blotchy and darker, perhaps suggesting time spent abroad or even an illness, and there are now lines appearing which define his cheeks. His mouth is more upturned at the corners, but his lips remain delicate and thin. The eyes have become more intense and stare back at the camera, and could almost be described as being disturbed if you think back to that portrait Les showed us of Don McCullen's shell-shocked soldier. And this is due to the widening and uncovering of more of the sclera, allowing for the pupils to be further isolated. Davis's hair remains largely unchanged, with the exception of his side part moving towards the centre of his head, and thus bringing the side bulge on the earlier portrait into more control. It is only when considering Davis's facial changes in combination with his pose and posture that we observe a completely different mood being portrayed. Bates suggests that the pose of the sitter is itself a visual argument or a form of rhetoric. The most significant aspect of this portrait is the clenched fist. Like Eisenstein some 20 years earlier in the film Battleship Potemkin, it can potentially be read as Hardman's use to signify Davis's anger and aggression. Okay, so moving on now to some more of the creative output. This intermissions exhibition was held at Liverpool Library between the 11th of December and the 29th of Jan, and it was also the subject of an OCA visit. It comprised of about 27 subject portrait pairings and prints displayed within 13 glass display cabinets. The venue was really important. It had to be in Liverpool, and I wanted to show the portraits behind the glass to place the emphasis upon the fact that the negative as artefact, like I'd spoken about earlier. It also had the added advantage of having two multimedia display screens which I could load up with textual information. Moving on then, the next project is going to be during the Liverpool biennial, which is planned for the evening of Friday the 8th of July. This, I don't know whether many of you have been down Liverpool Bowl Street, but this is quite a famous food place in Liverpool Matters. It was the original studio that Hardman shot all his work in. So these portraits that I intend to back project on the windows are the portraits that were taken in that room all those years ago. So it's significant in terms of where it is in that respect. And they're very happy to be involved with the project. They didn't know that that was the original space that Hardman used. And then another piece that I'm working on for the biennial, which I don't have a space established to show it yet, is this. It's like an A0 print, which basically is the entire contents of one tin. So there should be 400 images there, but obviously there are images which are missing because I'm interested in the gaps as well. This is part of the process. And then there's additional typologies to be made. There's a couple of quotes that I'll leave you with as I finish off. The most important one probably for me is the secular one at the end, which is, once an image is accepted and accessioned into the archives, it loses the meaning that was embedded in the relationship with its creator and previous users. Its meaning is literally up for grabs. So this is the idea that I'm making my own work now with Hardman's historic work. That's it. Okay. Thanks.